Hi, my name is Shayla Lawson, and I'm really excited to be celebrating with you the 50th anniversary of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. I am here with the organization Love is a Kind of Cure. You can find them on Instagram at Love Kind Cure, and throughout the month they are going to be broadcasting a read-along, of which I am a small part, in which we go through The Bluest Eye in its entirety. One of the reasons why in 2020 I feel that The Bluest Eye is a really important text for us to go back to is because it really takes a look at the formation of the Black identity as a second-class citizen, the Black American identity, I should say, and the ways in which colorism has affected that, and especially at a time in which people are really invested in conversations nationally around what Black identity means and what the placement of Black people means and what it means for us to be here. In addition to an international resurgence of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement, we see global protests happening everywhere. It is a really important time to look at what brought us to that point and what the history of Black Americans are. So we will take a look at that in this book, and I will read a small portion of it and come back to you after that. Here is the family, mother, father, Dick and Jane. They live in a green and white house. They are very... The Breedloves did not live in a storefront because they were having temporary difficulty adjusting to the cutbacks at the plant. They lived there because they were poor and Black, and they stayed there because they believed they were ugly. Although their poverty was traditional and stultifying, it was not unique. But their ugliness was unique. No one could have convinced them that they were not relentlessly and aggressively ugly. Except for the father, Julio, whose ugliness, the result of despair, dissipation, and violence directed toward petty things and weak people, was behavior. The rest of the family, Mrs. Breedlove, Sammy Breedlove, and Pecola Breedlove, wore their ugliness, put it on, so to speak, although it did not belong to them. The eyes, the small eyes, set closely together under narrow foreheads. The low, irregular hairlines, which seemed even more irregular in contrast to the straight, heavy eyebrows which nearly met. Keen but crooked noses with insolent nostrils. They had high cheekbones, and their eyes turned forward. Shapely lips which called attention not to themselves but to the rest of the face. You looked at them and wondered why they were so ugly. You looked closely and could not find the source. Then you realized that it came from conviction, their conviction. It was as though some mysterious, all-knowing master had given each one a cloak of ugliness to wear, and they had accepted it without question. The master had said, "You are ugly people." They had looked about themselves and saw nothing to contradict the statement, saw, in fact, support from it, leading from every billboard, every movie, every glance. "Yes," they had said, "you are right." And they took the ugliness into their hands, threw it as a mantle over them, and went about the world with it, dealing with it each according to his way. Mrs. Breedlove handled hers as an actor does a prop, for the articulation of character, for support of a role she frequently imagined was hers, martyrdom. Sammy used his as a weapon to cause others pain. He adjusted his behavior to it, chose his companions on the basis of it, people who could be fascinated, even intimidated by it. And Pecola, she hid behind hers, concealed, veiled, eclipsed, peeping out from behind the shroud very seldom, and then only to yearn for the return of her mask. This family, on a Saturday morning in October, began one by one to stir out of their dreams of affluence and vengeance into the anonymous misery of their storefront. Mrs. Breedlove slipped noiselessly out of bed, put a sweater on over her nightgown, which was an old day dress, and walked toward the kitchen. Her one good foot made hard, bony sounds. The twisted one whispered on the linoleum. In the kitchen, She made noise with doors, faucets, and pans. The noises were hollow, but the threats they implied were not. Bacola opened her eyes and lay staring at the dead coal stove. Charlie mumbled, thrashed about in the bed for a minute, and then was quiet. Even from where Bacola lay, she could smell Charlie's whiskey. The noises in the kitchen became louder and less hollow. There was direction and purpose in Mrs. Breedlove's movements that had nothing to do with the preparation of breakfast. This awareness, supported by ample evidence from the past, made Bacola tighten her stomach muscles and ration her breath. Charlie had come home drunk. Unfortunately, he had been too drunk to quarrel, so the whole business would have to erupt this morning. Because it had not taken place immediately, the oncoming fight would lack spontaneity. It would be calculated, uninspired, and deadly. Mrs. Breedlove came swiftly into the room and stood at the foot of the bed where Charlie lay. "I need some coal in this house." Charlie did not move. "Hear me?" Mrs. Breedlove grabbed Charlie's foot. Charlie opened his eyes slowly. They were red and menacing. With no exception, Charlie had the meanest eyes in town. "Ah, woman. I said I need some coal. It's as cold as a witch's tit in this house. Your whiskey ass wouldn't feel hellfire, but I'm cold. I got to do a lot of things, but I ain't gonna freeze. Leave me alone. Not until you get me some coal. If working like a mule don't give me the right to be warm, what am I doing it for? You sure ain't bringing in nothing. If it was up to you, we'd all be dead." Her voice was like an earache in the brain. "If you think I'm gonna wade out in the cold and get it myself, you better think again. I don't give a shit how you get it." A bubble of violence burst in his throat. "You going to get your drunk self out of that bed and get me some coal or not?" Silence. "Charlie." Silence. "Don't try me this morning, man. You say one more word and I'll split you open." Silence. All right, but if I sneeze once, just once, God help your butt." Sammy was awake now too, but pretending to be asleep. Bacola still held her stomach muscles taut and conserved her breath. They all knew that Mrs. Breedlove could have, would have, and had gotten coal from the shed, or that Sammy or Bacola could be directed to get it. But the unquarreled evening hung like the first note of a dirge in sullenly expectant air. An escapade of drunkenness, no matter how routine, had its own ceremonial close. The tiny, undistinguished days that Mrs. Breedlove lived were identified, grouped, and classed by these quarrels. They gave substance to the minutes and hours otherwise dimmed and unrecalled. They relieved the tiresomeness of poverty, gave grandeur to the dead rooms. In these violent breaks in routine that were themselves routine, she could display the style and imagination of what she believed to be her own true self. To deprive her of these fights was to deprive her of all of the zest and reasonableness of her life. Charlie, by his habitual drunkenness and orneriness, provided them both with the material they needed to make their lives tolerable. Mrs. Breedlove considered herself an upright and Christian woman, burdened with a no-count man, whom God wanted her to punish. Charlie was beyond redemption, of course, and redemption was hardly the point. Mrs. Breedlove was not interested in Christ the Redeemer, but rather Christ the Judge. Often, she could be heard discoursing with Jesus about Charlie, pleading with him to help her strike the bastard down from his pinnacle of pride. And once, when a drunken jester catapulted Charlie into the red-hot stove, she screamed, "Get him, Jesus, get him!" If Charlie had stopped drinking, she would have never forgiven Jesus. She needed Charlie's sins desperately. The lower he sank, the wilder and more irresponsible he became, the more splendid she and her task became in the name of Jesus. No less did Charlie need her. She was one of the few things abhorrent to him that he could touch and therefore hurt. He poured out on her the sum of all his inarticulate fury and aborted desires. Hating her, He could leave himself intact. When she was still very young, Charlie had been surprised in some bushes by two white men while he was newly but earnestly engaged in eliciting sexual pleasure from a little country girl. The men had shone a flashlight right on his behind. He had stopped, terrified. They chuckled. The beam of the flashlight did not move. "Go on," they said. "Go on and finish, and nigger, make it good." The flashlight did not move. For some reason, Charlie had not hated the white men. He hated, despised the girl. Even a half remembrance of this episode, along with myriad other humiliations, defeats, and emasculations, could stir him into fights of depravity that surprised himself, but only himself. Somehow he could not astound. He could only be astounded. So he gave that up too. Charlie and Mrs. Breedlove fought each other with a darkly brutal formalism that was paralleled only by their lovemaking. Tacitly, they had agreed not to kill each other. He fought her the way a coward fights a man, with feet, the palms of his hands, and teeth. She, in turn, fought back in a purely feminine way with frying pans and pokers, and occasionally a flat iron would sail toward his head. They did not talk, groan, or curse during these beatings. There was only the muted sound of falling things and flesh on unsurprised flesh. There was a difference in the reaction of the children to these battles. Sammy cursed for a while, or left the house, or threw himself into the fray. He was known, by the time he was 14, to have run away from home no less than 27 times. Once he got to Buffalo and stayed there. 3 months. His returns, whether by force or circumstance, were sullen. Pecola, on the other hand, restricted by youth and sex, experimented with methods of endurance. Though the methods varied, the bane was as consistent as it was deep. She struggled between an overwhelming desire that one would kill the other and a profound wish that she herself could die. Now she was whispering, "Don't, Mrs. Breedlove, don't." Pecola, like Sammy and Charlie, always called her mother Mrs. Breedlove. "Don't, Mrs. Breedlove, don't." But Mrs. Breedlove did. By the grace, no doubt, of God, Mrs. Breedlove sneezed. Just once. She ran into the bedroom with a dishpan full of cold water and threw it in Charlie's face. He sat up, choking and spitting. Naked and ashen, he leaped from the bed and with a flying tackle grabbed his wife around the waist, and they hit the floor. Charlie picked her up and knocked her down with the back of his hand. She fell in a sitting position, her back supported by Sammy's bed frame. She had not let go of the dishpan and began to hit at Charlie's thighs and groin with it. He put his foot in her chest, and she dropped the pan. Dropping to his knee, he struck her several times in the face, and she might have succumbed early had he not hit his hand against the metal bed frame when his wife ducked. Mrs. Breedlove took advantage of this momentary suspension of blows and slipped out of his reach. Sammy, who had watched in silence their struggling at his bedside, suddenly began to hit his father about the head with both fists, shouting, "You naked fuck!" over and over and over. Mrs. Breedlove, having snatched up the round, flat stove lid, ran tippy-toed Charlie as he was pulling himself up from his knees and struck him 2 blows, knocking him right back into the senselessness out of which she had provoked him. Panting, she threw a quilt over him and let him lie. Sammy screamed, "Kill him! Kill him!" Mrs. Breedlove looked at Sammy with surprise. "Cut out that noise, boy." She put the stove lid back in place and walked toward the kitchen. At the doorway, she paused long enough to say to her son, "Get up from there anyhow. I need some coal." Letting herself breathe easy now, Pecola covered her head with the quilt. The sick feeling, which she had tried to prevent by holding in her stomach, came quickly in spite of her precaution. There surged in her the desire to heave, but as always, she knew she would not. Please, God, she whispered into the palm of her hand, please make me disappear. She squeezed her eyes shut. Little parts of her body faded away, now slowly, now with a rush. Slowly again, her fingers went one by one, then her arms disappeared all the way to the elbow, her feet now. Yes, that was good. The legs all at once. It was hardest above the thighs. She had to be real still and pull. Her stomach would not go. But finally, it too went away. Then her chest, her neck. The face was hard too, almost done, almost. Only her tight, tight eyes were left. They were always left. Try as she might, she could never get her eyes to disappear. So what was the point? They were everything. Everything was there. In them. All of those pictures, all of those faces. She had long ago given up the idea of running away to see new pictures, new faces, as Sammy had so often done. He never took her, and he never thought about his going ahead of time, so it was never planned. It wouldn't have worked anyway. As long as she had looked the way she did, as long as she was ugly, she would have to stay with these people. Somehow she belonged to them. Long hours she sat looking in the mirror, trying to discover the secret of the ugliness that made her ignored or despised at school, by teachers and classmates alike. She was the only member of her class who sat alone at a double desk. The first letter of her name forced her to sit in the front of the room, always. But what about Marie Apollinaire? Marie was in front of her, but she shared a desk with Luke Angelino. Her teachers had always treated her this way. They had never tried to glance at her and called on her only when everyone was required to respond. She also knew that when one of the girls at school wanted to be particularly insulting to a boy or wanted to get an immediate response from him, she could say, Bobby loves Picola Breedlove, Bobby loves Picola Breedlove, and never fail to get peals of laughter from those in earshot and mock anger from the accused. It had occurred to Picola some time ago that if her eyes, those eyes that held the pictures and knew the sights, if those eyes of hers were different, that is to say, beautiful, she herself would be different. Her teeth were good, and at least her nose was not big and flat like some of those who were thought so cute. If she looked different, beautiful, maybe Charlie would be different, and Mrs. Breedlove too. Maybe they'd say, why, look at pretty-eyed Picola. We mustn't do bad things in front of those pretty eyes. Pretty eyes, pretty blue eyes, big blue pretty eyes. Run, Jip runs, Alice runs, Alice has blue eyes, Jerry has blue eyes, Jerry runs, Alice runs, they run with their blue eyes, 4 blue eyes, 4 pretty blue eyes, blue sky eyes, blue like Mrs. Forrest's blue blouse eyes, morning glory blue eyes, Alice and Jerry blue storybook eyes. Each night without fail she prayed for blue eyes. Fervently for a year she had prayed. Although somewhat discouraged, she was not without hope. To have something as wonderful as that happen would take a long, long time. Thrown in this way into the binding conviction that only a miracle could relieve her, she would never know her beauty. She would only see what there was to see, the eyes of other people. She walks down Garden Avenue to a small grocery store which sells penny candy. 3 pennies are in her shoe, slipping back and forth between the sock and the inner sole. With each step, she feels the painful press of the coins against her foot. A sweet, endurable, even cherished irritation full of promise and delicate security. There's plenty of time to consider what to buy. Now, however, she moves down an avenue gently buffeted by the familiar and therefore loved images. The dandelions at the base of the telephone pole. Why, she wonders, do people call them weeds? She thought they were pretty. But grown-ups say, Miss Dunyan keeps her yard so nice, not a dandelion anywhere. Hunky women in black babushas go into the fields with baskets to pull them up. But they do not want the yellow heads, only the jagged leaves. They make dandelion soup, dandelion wine. Nobody loves the head of the dandelion. Maybe because they are so many, strong, and soon. There was a sidewalk crack shaped like a Y, and the other one that lifted up the concrete from the dirt floor. Frequently, sloughing her step had made her trip over that one. Skates would go well over this sidewalk. Old it was and smooth. It made the wheels glide evenly with a mild whir. The newly paved walks were bumpy and uncomfortable, and the sound of skate wheels on new walks was grating. These and other inanimate things she saw and experienced. They were real to her. She knew them. They were the codes and touchstones of the world, capable of translation and possession. She owned the crack that made her stumble. She owned the clumps of dandelions whose white heads last fall she had blown away, whose yellow heads this fall she peered into. And owning them made her a part of the world, and the world a part of her. She climbs 4 wooden steps to the door of Yakubowski's fresh veg, meat, and sundry store. A bell tinkles as she opens it. Standing before the counter, she looks at the array of candies. All Mary Janes, she decides. 3 for a penny. The resistant sweetness that breaks open at last to deliver peanut butter. The oil and salt which complement the sweet pull of caramel. A peal of anticipation unsettles her stomach. She pulls off her shoe and takes out 3 pennies. The gray head of Mr. Yakubowski's looms over the counter. He urges his eyes out of his thoughts to encounter her. Blue eyes, blear dropped. Slowly, like Indian summer moving imperceptibly toward fall, he looks toward her. Somewhere between retina and object, between vision and view, his eyes draw back, hesitate, and hover. At some fixed point in time and space, he senses that he need not waste the effort of a glance. He does not need to see her, because for him there is nothing to see. How can a 52-year-old white immigrant storekeeper with the taste of potatoes and beer in his mouth, his mind honed on the doe-eyed Virgin Mary, his sensibilities blunted by a permanent awareness of loss, see a little black girl? Nothing in his life even suggested that the feat was possible, not to say desirable or necessary. Yeah. She looks up at him and sees the vacuum where curiosity ought to lodge and something more. A total absence of human recognition. The glazed separateness. She does not know what keeps his glance suspended. Perhaps because he is grown, or a man, or she is a little girl. But she has seen interest, disgust, even anger in grown male eyes. Yet this vacuum is not new to her. It has an edge. Somewhere in the bottom lid is the distaste. She has seen its lurking in the eyes of all white people. So, the distaste must be for her blackness. All things in her are flux and anticipation. But her blackness is static and dread. And it is the blackness that accounts for it, that creates the vacuum edged with distaste in white eyes. She points her finger at the Mary Janes, a little black shaft of finger, its tip pressed on the display window, the quietly inoffensive assertion of a black child's attempt to communicate with a white adult. Them. The word is more a sigh than a sense. What? These? Phlegm and impatience mingle in his voice. She shakes her head, her fingertip fixed on the spot which, in her view, at any rate, identifies the Mary Janes. He cannot see her view. The angle of his vision, the slant of her finger, makes it incomprehensible to him. His lumpy red hand plops around in the glass casing like the agitated head of a chicken outraged by the loss of his body. Christ, Concha, talk. His fingers brush the Mary Janes. She nods. Well, why didn't you say so? One? How many? Pecola unfolds her fist, showing the 3 pennies. He scoots 3 Mary Janes toward her, 3 yellow rectangles in each packet. She holds the money toward him. He hesitates, not wanting to touch her hand. She does not know how to move the finger of her right hand from the display counter or how to get the coins out of her left hand. Finally, he reaches over and takes the pennies from her hand. His nails graze her damp palm. Outside, Pecola feels the inexplicable shame ebb. Dandelions. A dart of affection leaps out from her to them, but they do not look at her and do not send love back. She thinks, they are ugly. They are weeds. Preoccupied with that revelation, she trips on the sidewalk crack. Anger stirs and wakes in her. It opens its mouth and like a hot-mouthed puppy laps up the dredges of her shame. Anger is better. There is a sense of being in anger, a reality and presence, an awareness of worth. It is a lovely surging. Her thoughts ball back into Mr. Jakubowski's eyes, his phlegmy voice. The anger will not hold. The puppy is too easily surfeited. Its thirst too quickly quenched. It sleeps. The shame wells up again, its muddy rivulet seeping into her eyes. What to do before the tears come? She remembers the Mary Janes. Each pale yellow wrapper has a picture on it. A picture of little Mary Jane, for whom the candy is named. Smiling white face, blonde hair in gentle disarray, blue eyes looking out at her world of clean comfort. The eyes are petulant and mischievous. To Pecola, they are simply pretty. She eats the candy, and its sweetness is good. To eat the candy is somehow to eat the eyes, eat Mary Jane, love Mary Jane, be Mary Jane. 3 pennies had brought her 9 lovely orgasms with Mary Jane, lovely Mary Jane, for whom a candy is named. So that is my section of Bluest Eye. I hope that you continue to keep up with At Love Kind Cure. Love is a kind of cure for their ongoing reading. In terms of how I feel about that particular section, well, I think the best way to sum it up is I used an epigraph by Toni Morrison in my most recent book. This is major, and I'm reading it because I always forget exactly what Toni said, but the quote is, "Racists always try to make you think they are the majority, but they never are." And the reason why I think that is so important as a Toni Morrison quote and why I chose it as an epigraph is because of how innately and how deeply racism affects the ways that we look at people and the ways that we view our humanity and the ways that we think of that as subtle and imperceptible, but the ways that it is deeply problematic and hurtful. And when we see that from the eyes of the child, the ways that she is unseen by the violence in her family that is perpetuated by their position of blackness and quote unquote ugliness, and ugliness that is really situated around a Western convention of what people should look like. And we see that continue to be a part of her interaction with this older man who should be able to view her as a young and innocent little girl, but instead sees this ugly, menacing face and is unwilling to be moved by her vulnerability. We see the same thing happen to her at school and the way that she is singled out to sit by herself, and the ways that the kids make fun of her as being so abhorrent that she is her own insult. All of those things start to add up. All of them are a part of an ongoing relationship to blackness and the insufficiency of blackness that Black Americans, and by extension the Black diaspora, has had to deal with in our coming to terms with who we are and finding a beauty and a value in ourselves and particularly when it comes to the ways that that has affected Black women and the ways that it has made our culture alienate Black women from any kind of safety or any kind of protection or any kind of value. I think it's something that we really need to, not I think, it is something that we all need to deeply interrogate in order for any of us to move forward. So it's something that I thank Toni Morrison for putting on the page, because it's not an easy thing to do or look at. It's not an easy thing to see ourselves in these reflections of ugliness that are not just the ways that the polis see themselves on a superficial level, but a larger commentary on the culture that we live in at large. So for that, I want to say thank you. And thank you not only to Toni Morrison, but to Love is Kind of Cure for bringing attention to these kinds of issues. And thank you to you for spending time with me. I really appreciate it.